Hello everyone, my name is Alex Murray. I'm a police officer in West Midlands, the West Midlands Police, currently a temporary assistant chief constable. But for a long time within policing, I've been interested in what works. And for that, you can read evidence-based policing. So how do we know what we're doing has a real impact? How do we measure that? How do we understand what's effective and what isn't effective? And as I learned about this, I was astounded at how much information there is out there that is really relevant to us. I did a master's in criminology under the professorship of Larry Sherman and was exposed to some of this stuff and thought, wow, this is so relevant to everybody that everybody needs to know about it. And it was for that reason, really, I started a small group of people really that became a charity called the Society of Evidence-Based Policing, really, that sought to get the message out there around what's effective and what isn't. And we're quite a small outfit of police officers and police staff, but the idea is sort of contagious, and there's now a Society of Evidence-Based Policing in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America, starting in India, Scandinavia, Spain. So where professionals want to take control themselves, really, rather than being told always what to do, to make a real difference. Okay, well, I won't do it quickly, but I think it's quite ironic that in the police service we have thousands of rules on how you get evidence that you put before a court. You can only do it in certain ways. You have to know that the evidence is really good, you've got to test it, and that testimony is really important, and we understand the rationale for that. But when we are engaging in certain tactics or we have an idea, the level of evidence we require to start that idea or that tactic is non-existent. So someone just has a bright idea and they say, we're going to do this from this point on. And if we use examples of bright ideas that have gone wrong because they haven't been based on evidence, then that sometimes tells the story. So the famous one is of Scared Straight, where police officers naturally think, well, what we need to do is get naughty kids, send them to a prison, get them to meet inmates, and they'll be so scared that they won't commit crime anymore, antisocial behaviour. And in fact, when they took an evidence-based approach, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute, it showed that the kids became worse as a result of that. Similarly, taking drugs into school and talking kids through drugs has shown to be at best ineffective and sometimes more harmful. So an evidence-based approach means we analyse whether the tactics we're engaging in are really effective or not. And it goes beyond where policing normally is, which is there's a problem, we engage in a tactic, and then we see if there's a problem after that. The sort of before and after approach that has plagued policing. And I equate it to this little story, really. You know, I've been a senior leader in policing, but I've been a PC as well, and I've seen senior leaders stand up and say, you know, since I've taken over this command, burglary has gone down 20%. And what that leader is saying is, because of my great leadership, burglary's gone down 20%. And as a constable, I know that's not down to your great leadership. But when crime goes up 20%, the same leader doesn't go in front of his staff or her staff and say, burglary's gone up and I'm sorry, it's because I'm a really rubbish police officer. And I don't know how to lead you. They start saying, you know, it's because sentences are too short, it's because there's issues with the economy, no one can get a job, bad parenting, all these, you know, socioeconomic factors. And the truth is, as a leader, you can't have it both ways. So we have to be evidence-based. And that means adopting research methods that will tell us whether we are being effective or not, or research methods to understand what the real problem is. And it's saying, what is the best way of trying to answer the question you're posing as a police officer? So if it is, how do we get burglary down? How do we get robbery down? How do we get violence down? It's not saying, I know the idea. It's saying, well, I have an idea and I'm going to test it to see whether that's effective. I think that's a very long-winded way, but probably a necessarily long-winded way of speaking through what evidence-based policing is. The relevance of an evidence-based approach in policing is quite new. So the phrase was only coined in '97 by Sherman in America. So evidence-based policy has sort of been around for longer than that. Evidence-based practice in medicine obviously has been around a lot longer than that. The method of thought, if you like, goes way back to the Enlightenment movement and the use of the scientific method around hypothesis testing, and testing what's observable. How that has become mainstream, or is becoming mainstream in policing, I would say is only in the last 10 years. And you know, if you go back to medicine, hundreds of years ago, they didn't have an evidence-based approach. You know, only 150 years ago, people were still engaging in practices from a medical point of view that were incredibly harmful because it was just a good idea that had been passed down from generation to generation. I think right now, we in policing are passing down ideas to each other that are still harmful to the citizen or to ourselves because we haven't engaged in evidence-based approaches. So probably two things really. One is the College of Policing really recognises that evidence-based approaches are healthy and that it's a core tenet of the College of Policing. But also I think organisations like ours, like the Society of Evidence-Based Policing, that is definitely there for practitioners and professional researchers to work together. That has had an effect where we go out and we communicate research evidence to people that says sometimes what you thought you knew, you didn't know and is wrong. And sometimes the stuff you have been doing is actually right and let's work out how to do it better. So I think, you know, 10 years ago, it wasn't really spoken about, but now, certainly in my police force, West Midlands Police, it's quite hard for someone to make an assertion about a reduction in crime without saying, and here's the control. Now, that would have never happened 10 years ago. And there's still some police forces where, you know, an evidence-based approach is not embraced. And unfortunately, personalities come into it quite a lot and some people don't like it. But the scientific method is definitely here to stay. Yeah, so I definitely think there's a long way, for example, West Midlands Police to go, but I think West Midlands Police, GMP, and increasingly some other police forces are getting more evidence-based. I think it happens through two mechanisms. One is the College of Policing, which provides quite a lot of architecture to support an evidence-based approach. It has base camps, they call it. It's got the What Works Centre, which is brilliant, and any of your viewers should just go into College of Policing What Works. They've got a great bubble diagram that really highlights everything that's effective. So they provide quite a lot of infrastructure. And then the way I think it really spreads is like anything that's contagious, and I think it's through word of mouth and it's by people getting involved. The leaders who I have seen get involved in evidence-based policing have been involved in a small trial, for example, or they've done something in an evidence-based approach, involved their staff, and then their staff see the benefit of it, and they've engaged in evidence-based approaches and have infected other staff, and it is like a contagion. And you can track, in actual fact, and I could track in West Midlands, you know, the first bit of work we did, some people got involved, caught the bug, did some more research, other people involved in that, they caught the bug, and it sort of spreads that way. So I'm of a firm view, really. You can say it and tell it all you like, but unless our teams are involved in it, it won't necessarily be done as much as it should. No, I think it's a bottom-up approach, but let's not be mutually exclusive here. To be bottom-up, you need top cover. So you know, I think the first randomised control trial we did in the West Midlands was about antisocial behaviour when I was on a counter-terrorism unit. But the staff on the ground, the PCs and some of the sergeants who were involved in it, now many of them went on to do other bits of evidence-based work that has had a huge impact here in the West Midlands. And then they've sort of infected other people. So I think if you don't have top cover, and I can think of police forces at the moment where the top cover has changed and people are not in support of evidence-based approaches, that suddenly it really disenfranchises staff who were involved in it, and they think, do you know what, there's no point doing this anymore. So you need authority from the top, but definitely if it's going to make a difference, ground level up. there's not a lot of evidence about things that really backfire. So scared straight is quite a tired example, I think, but we use it just to demonstrate what an evidence-based approach is. There's quite a lot of evidence around what's just ineffective. So it's like a waste of time, really. You do something and you think it's great, but it's not actually doing anything beneficial. So perhaps one of the biggest experiments that we did in the West Midlands that has made a huge impact was an experiment called Turning Point. Perhaps we'll talk about experiments in a bit, because I don't want any of your viewers to think that evidence-based policing is solely about randomised control trials. That's not right, but randomised control trials have a place, and we did a big randomised control trial based on some research that we'd read that showed that short-term prison sentences have a backfiring effect. So as you know, in policing, our Pelian principle is to prevent crime, and yet the evidence and the data was telling us we spend all our time catching these people, we send them to prison, and it makes them cause more crime. Now that is a huge contradiction, or it's like a gremlin in the machinery of how we practice policing, where our effort is to prevent crime, and actually we potentially might be creating it. So that was really inconvenient evidence, if you like, and we wanted to do something about it. So working with Peter Nehru from Cambridge University and Professor Sherman and others, we devised a trial called Turning Point, where people who were about to be charged, so this is beyond the cautioning level, were randomly allocated into two groups. One group was charge them as usual and they go to court. The other group was go and see an offender manager who would work through a contract with you, try and understand what behaviour had happened and what you should do as a result of that. And if you stuck to that sort of informal contract with the officer, after 6 months, nothing. But if you didn't and you breached that contract, then we called it the sword of Damocles would come down and you'd be charged as usual. Now the data years later was analysed from the people who'd gone to court and the people who had been referred to offender managers, and we saw significant differences. So firstly, people who had gone to court were arrested more, they caused more harm, and they cost more money. And those who were diverted were arrested less, caused less harm, and saved the police a load of money. So that was an experiment that demonstrated a principle that we don't actually have to create more crime as policing, we can do something about it. And as a result of that, we created whole teams within our CID environment that sort of processed prisoners in a very similar fashion, adopting those principles. And similarly then, Durham Police have followed that principle with Operation Checkpoint, doing a very similar thing, but instead of referring people away from courts to police officers, they've referred them to non-police officers. And I believe early signs are that that looks promising. So that's a fine example of how we took an experiment and mainstreamed it into how we operate. And I've got another, just quite a nifty one as well, if you're ready for it, and that's working with the behavioural insight team, where we can talk more about behavioural insights if you want to in a minute, but we were sending out 3,500 fines a month to motorists in the West Midlands for speeding. And the way it works here in the UK is you don't get the fine straight away, you get a letter saying, we've caught you speeding, do you accept this? If you do, respond, and we'll decide whether you get a course or whether you go to court. Now, if you read that letter, and I have to confess I have been caught speeding and I got the letter, it's written in legal mumbo-jumbo by probably lawyers and police officers, and it really misses the point, and it's confusing and you don't really know what to do. And what we found was that up to 40% of respondents or people were failing to respond to the letter because they would probably put it in a pile somewhere and it wouldn't operate well. So we just changed the letter and we put a picture of a lamppost on it with teddy bears, you know, and some truthful data around the amount of children killed by speeding motorists, and we simplified the form. And then we tried the normal form 1 week, and the new form another week, normal form 1 week, new form another week, aggregated the data, and the response rates were tremendous. So people paid 20% quicker, they re-offended 20% less, and they went to court, or they responded correctly, 40% more, just by changing a letter. And the only reason we knew that was because we took an evidence-based approach. We tested it against the normal letter. So we did our sort of randomised control trial with that, saving the force up to £1.5 million a year. One small, tiny innovation tested rigorously that becomes mainstream. And that experiment's now being replicated up to 7 times around the world. That depends on how rigorous you want your evaluation to be. Now, I am not somebody who says everything has to be gold-plated. So if you're a sergeant or a constable or member of police staff, I think it is perfectly reasonable to say, I'm going to try this new way of operating in a couple of areas or with a couple of offenders and have a couple of control areas, and we'll see if there's a mean difference between those two areas, in which case we do that ourselves. Of course, that would never pass muster with a journal or with an academic institution, but it would be a lot more rigorous than what we've done previously. And so that's a PCSO or a police officer or a member of police staff doing it themselves. For the experiment in relation to Turning Point, that was a large-scale, complex, rigorous evaluation, in Cambridge University helped us with that and did a lot of the analytics, and that was through a grant that they were provided with, so it didn't cost West Midlands Police anything. Same with the Behavioural Insights team. They did the analysis on the data for the speeding trial, but again, they received funding from a philanthropic institution to do that analysis, so it cost West Midlands Police nothing. So I don't think really there's many police forces at the moment that have the internal capability to do very strong, rigorous evaluations. But every force has the capability to do quite strong ones. And I've written before on the sort of curve that you need, depending on the rigor you need and the cost you want to invest, on whether you should go external or internal. But there's a beautiful symbiotic relationship that we can have with professional researchers, where they are very much in the UK remunerated by demonstrating impact, and the way they do that is through working with police. So we exchange our our site and what we do and our practices and our data for their professional research expertise, and no money changes hands at all. That's how I would see it operating. Yeah, and so we share the results in a number of ways. If the experiment is rigorous enough, we publish it, but that's read largely by academics. But it is picked up in systematic reviews and then explored on the What Works website, for example, and other websites. Otherwise, we do it through conferences. So conferences like the Society of Evidence-Based Policing conferences. The Society of Evidence-Based Policing has got regional coordinators who run local conferences sometimes. There's really good ones in the southwest and southeast. And otherwise, word of mouth, putting it in things like Police Professional, and also subject matter expert conferences. So, for example, there was a road safety conference where that speeding trial was spoken about and other people heard about it. So there are a whole manner of places that can pick up on that. And things like your website. So, there's not a type of person who does evidence-based policing, and I really want to get away from any ideas that this is about degrees or levels of education. Some of the best pieces of research I've seen done in policing have been done by people who haven't got degrees and who just want to make a difference. Some of the longest serving people who don't have degrees or anything like that can make a huge impact by being evidence-based. And so my advice to them was there's this lovely phrase, if you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat. And I would say, just do it. You know, have a go, linking to people who can assist. I mean, there's very few police forces at the moment who would say that they don't want to do evidence-based policing. So there will be experts in the policing. Contact the Society of Evidence-Based Policing. You can email them. People will contact you and support you. The College of Policing will support you. There'll be a whole host of academics who would want to work with you if you wanted to do something more rigorous. But it's incredibly satisfying, I think, as a police officer. You know, if you're a PCSO, just doing something yourself, you know, you could say, right, I'm going to do this tactic. And so something I've thought about recently quite a lot was insecure cars. So a lot of PCSOs around the country go around and they'll test car doors, and if they're open, they'll knock on the house and say that your car door's open. And now I don't know if that's worthwhile or not. It might be, it might not be, but any PCSO could say, right, these 10 streets, I'm going to test all the doors rigorously over the next, you know, month or 2 months, and the another 10 streets I'm not going to. And then let's look at the theft of insecure vehicles from those 10 streets to not the other 10 streets, and they could do all that analysis themselves, and they could then present it to the force and go, look, this is what I found, and in actual fact, we've made a difference here, and so everybody should do it. Or, do you know what, it didn't make any difference, so my advice to all the PCSOs checking car doors is don't. And I don't know what the answer is, but that's a fine example, for example, of somebody who doesn't need any expert sort of input to just go out and do some stuff and take the initiative. The Society of Evidence-Based Policing's got 3 aims really. It wants to encourage the policing family to communicate best research evidence, and this is what we're doing right now, to use it. So we don't want to sit in our ivory towers pontificating about what works and what doesn't. We want to actually use it, and I'll speak more about that in a bit if you'll let me. Remind me about the triple T. And then we want to produce it. So police officers, police staff, we want to actually, you know, our whole world is a laboratory, and we can do and understand stuff better if we take an evidence-based approach. So that's our 3 aims. We're really ambitious as a very small charity, but we're run by people who are really busy, like you and me and others. So really our offer at the moment is some internet content, but an incredibly cheap conferences. So you've just been to the one at the Royal Society for £85. You know, and with the level of speakers we got, international people from around the world, you'd pay £1,000 for that really easily. But we're not interested in making money. We're interested in achieving our aims. So that's a big bonus. We have a network of regional coordinators who bring together meetings, like the national meeting, but on a local basis, and who share best practice. That's where we are at the moment, but we want to achieve so much more, but we're unable to. But we're looking at bringing someone into employment soon, so I think you'll see some changes. What I would say is you can join SEBP in 10 minutes. Just go onto the website, click on the form, put your details on, you automatically go onto a mailing list, you're then a member, and you'll get some inputs across on email, and hopefully that will increase. And there's different models of SEBPs around the world, but that's what SEBP is. And a question I'm often asked is, so what's the difference between SEBP and the College of Policing? Well, look, they're very different. You know, the college is a huge outfit. They've got some really good people in there working on evidence-based policing, doing the what works, providing quite a lot of the architecture. I think we really work well with the college just by being agents of communication, building enthusiasm for evidence-based approaches. I always say we're sort of a hearts and minds sort of organisation where we really get police officers and staff to do stuff in an evidence-based manner. So that's what we do. An oft criticism of evidence-based policing is tell me something I don't know. You know, evidence-based policing will say this is really effective, and then an officer will say, well, yeah, I know that's really effective. And Sherman came up with this nice sort of 3 R's and 3 T approaches. So he would argue that the traditional policing is 3 R's. It's response policing, it's random patrol, and it's reactive investigation. That's what police officers around the world do all the time. And it needs to evolve into a triple T organisation by targeting, firstly. The first one is targeting. So how do we target our assets most effectively? So who do you know are the top 10 worst offenders, or the top 10 repeat victims, or where you need to put your officers most, or which places existing which has the most harm, which domestic violence relationship is most dangerous, you target. And that's very much by adopting the scanning approach, scanning and analysis approach, if you take the SARA methodology from pop policing. The next one is then you test what's effective. So once you've targeting your resources effectively, you test. So if you don't know something is effective, let's do a little test and understand and evaluate whether it is effective or not. And the third T then is probably the most interesting, because it's called tracking. And this is what I think is really interesting. And I think what Sherman means by tracking is, when you understand something is effective or not, track your staff and your activity to really know and understand that they are engaged in what works. So the fine example of this is hotspot policing, which now is incredibly cliched, and everyone goes, oh, please don't tell me any more evidence about hotspot policing. But the amount of work that officers actually do on hotspot policing is severely limited. And if we took a better tracked approach, we would have our officers in the right place at the right time doing the right thing. There's some great data that Tom Kirchmeier has just produced from a big force, where he's mapped patrol areas of police officers and police staff on sort of proactive patrol, and he's found a completely inverse relationship between where people patrol and crime hotspots. So people aren't patrolling in the areas where there is the greatest crime. In actual fact, quite the opposite. And I sort of understand that. When you're working hard all day, sometimes you don't want to go to a place where there's going to be a load of issues or something. But if we take a tracking approach, we can just be that much more effective. And that's not a big brother tracking. That's just a feedback loop where we are saying, okay, we really need to be in this location at this time. Make sure you're there, and let's understand if we are there or not. That's what we mean by tracking. For me, there's two types of question. One is what works, and that often requires an empirical form of analysis, where we might do some data analysis, we might do some statistics, we might aggregate data and understand some of the outcomes, and so you probably need to be a little bit au fait with how we use data. Particularly if you're using things like randomized controlled trials and forest plots and other technical issues like that professional researchers can assist us as cops with. If your question is what's happening and why is it happening, often that would benefit from a more qualitative approach. And again, police officers are not short of opinions. They will tell you why something is happening, and they will tell you what works without any evidence whatsoever. And so if, for example, you want to understand, so why is there a spate of robberies in this area? You might want to go out and interview all the offenders who've been caught in that area and try and understand motivation, do some analysis of the victims. If you want to understand why someone's behaving in a particular way, an empirical approach isn't going to answer that question, but some interviews, focus groups, ethnographic research where you sort of live with the people, that's really useful. And I think there's probably three things that combine together to make a really effective police officer or police service. And one is the qualitative approach, one is the quantitative approach, being good with data, and then one is just experience. And if there's anything I want to get across is that we're not evidence-based at the expense of experience. If you can meld experience and streetcraft and knowledge with data and qualitative research together, I think you'll have a sort of perfect approach, and that's what we would always try and push. There's something around digesting research that any officer can do. So they can look at the College of Policing website and take notice of what it says and just engage in that activity. I think a lot of stuff you see published will be, by its very nature, quite rigorous if it is empirical, and it'll be rigorous if it is qualitative. So I'm just trying to think of some research that, I mean, that example, for example, of trying car doors is one that I think would be really easy to do and isn't a randomized controlled trial. I did some research on phoning back victims of car crime to see if we got any better results from phoning them back rather than visiting them, rather than not phoning them back at all. And that just involved a spreadsheet and then looking at some outcome data, because it's one of those things where everyone says, okay, well, let's phone everyone back and see if we can get any more evidence. Well, that's okay, but what's the effect going to be on investigative outcomes? And that's quite easy to analyse. And then there's quite a lot of existing big data sets out there that you can just cast your lens to as well and have a look at. So I guess some of the groundbreaking studies have been quite high level empirical, but some of the stuff that will just inform us day to day won't make the headlines, but can make a difference in how you operate. I'll point them in a number of directions. So the first one would be College of Policing website on what works. I would then, there's two books that have recently been written. Cynthia Lum's done a very good book on evidence-based policing, published last year. I can't remember where's the publisher, but if you just put evidence-based policing and Cynthia Lum in Google, you'll find it. Then Laura Huey and Renee Mitchell have recently published a book on evidence-based policing and its growth. They published that this year, so if you type those two authors in, you'll find it. There's a number of search tools. So Cynthia Lum also has the evidence-based policing matrix that highlights a load of different evidence-based policing approaches and results. There's a thing called the Global Policing Database that has already synthesized all research, and you can use, it's free. Just put Global Policing Database in and type in something, and it will bring up all the relevant academic articles that have been sifted through that are useful for you. So whether that's violence, domestic violence, car theft, sex crimes, whatever it is, you put that in and it would bring up all relevant literature. So that's where I'd start, and of course I'd say join the Society of Evidence-Based Policing, come to a conference, go to some local groups, become an evidence-based policing champion. There's a lot of good stuff out there. I'm just not sure where Cambridge is on publication of that yet, but I think if you put Operation Turning Point into Google right now, I think there are some PowerPoint slides from previous conferences where people like Jamie Hobday and Larry Sherman have spoken on it. The other thing they can do is just contact the Society of Evidence-Based Policing, and we can put them in touch with people in relation to Turning Point. There is a little book that Sherman and Nehru wrote called The Sword of Damocles, or that's certainly in the title, and that very much underpins the theoretical concept of Turning Point. I'd like to bust some myths, really. So myth one is that you need to be a graduate to be involved in evidence-based policing. Wrong. I just think you need to massively care about what the outcomes we're achieving on the street. That's it. And I know 99% of police officers and staff do want to do that. Myth two is it's all about randomized control trials. It's not. There's a place for them, but there's a place for qualitative research as well, and there's a place for other types of empirical analysis. If you're targeting testing and tracking, you might not need a RCT at all. So that's another myth I want to bust. Myth three I'd like to bust is that this is at the expense of experience and knowledge and street craft developed over years and years. No, absolutely not. It needs to complement it. and we just need to be well-rounded, I think, and scholars and really brainy people need to understand actually what it's like on the street and what it's like dealing with this stuff, and at the same time people who work on the street working really hard need to, I think, understand what data can tell us to make us improve what we do. So none of this is mutually exclusive, and in our fractious world it's quite easy sometimes just to throw stuff at each other and criticize whichever side you're on. If you like qualitative research, you criticize the empirical stuff. If you like empirical research, you criticize the qualitative stuff. And if you don't like either, but you're a great cop, you criticize both the others, and vice versa. And no, that's not where we're at. We're at building an understanding of what's effective together using the best of all those three approaches. So they're perhaps the three myths I'd like to bust the most. Evidence-based policing allows us much better to understand the impact that we're having. And that's really important nowadays when there's not much money sloshing around, because we need to demonstrate bang for our buck. And we're obsessed, rightly, as policing is making a positive difference. That anybody can do it, and that with the advice that we've just spoken about, to learn about it, to reach out, and to engage in doing it. And the third thing I would encourage people to do is just to get involved, and just to think, okay, what is there out there that would tell me that there might be a better way of doing this? How can I test what I'm doing is effective or not? Get involved and have a go yourself at doing your own analysis. It's never going to be perfect, and there'll be lots of critics out there, and Teddy Roosevelt told us it's not the critic that counts. Let's just get involved and have a go, is what I would encourage people to do. And the more you learn, the more you realise you don't know. Every day is a school day for all of us involved in this. So it's all good. And I'm sure you will bring loads of stuff from an investigative side, and particularly around investigative interviewing. There's the research around that could be really interesting, around how we could better engage in interviewing, whether that's with victims or witnesses. I think there's some research out there on it, but not a lot. And some of the trauma-informed stuff, I think, is really interesting. I'd love to see more research on what's effective as far as trauma-informed policing, and what's effective in challenging ACEs. So everybody is talking about adverse childhood experiences at the moment, and the data is really strong that shows correlations between ACEs and crime-causing people. The data is not strong on what policing can do to work with that information. So now we have someone who suffers more than 4 ACEs. So what are you going to do as a police officer about that? And what do you mean when you say we're going to be trauma-informed? I'd love to see more research on that.
Thank you for watching. I hope you found this content useful. You can get an email with a PDF transcript of each new video that is uploaded right into your inbox. Just go to the main Dr IPIP website on dripip.com, and you can input your details in the sidebar. Just enter your first name, your preferred email address, and the type of organization you work for. You will not get any spam. This is just for me to be able to let you know about new content.